Hey everybody, welcome to Terror Talk.
Welcome.
I wanted to say I hope you guys listened to some of the encore episodes that we grabbed from season 1 because I edited, re-edited, bumped the sound, fixed all the things, those Ted Bundy episodes within an inch of their lives.
Was Saving Neverland season 1?
Mm-hmm.
That's a good episode.
It was a good episode. I agree.
I'm glad you redid that one.
I'm glad as well. And I did some more. And so, you know, if you want to revisit those, I'm going to do those from time to time because we do have a treasure trove of season 1 episodes that are not available to the public anymore because as soon as we got our good sound, I took them down.
They're in the vault,
They're in the
as
vault.
they say.
But there's a lot of good material. Like that Ted Bundy series is really good. And so, you know, I wanted to make it palatable, listenable.
You know what's terrifying?
No.
What we're about to talk about?
Yeah. So today on the show, we're going to talk about the HBO documentary, Six Schizophrenic Siblings is what it's called. And I'm just going to give you, if you have not watched this, it's a strong recommend as far as it's such a unique situation. And also if you're into psych, obviously like we are, and you're also aware that when you watch some documentaries that are psychologically oriented or true crime oriented, it's a bit of a horror show. So it all kind of goes together. And this 4-part series chronicles the psychosis, murder, suicide, and incest that interlace the lives of the Galvins, the Colorado Springs family made famous in Robert Kolker's award-winning New York Times best-selling 2020 nonfiction book, which was entitled Hidden Valley Road. After moving to this town, I guess in the 1950s, Don and Mimi Calvin raised a dozen children, 10 sons and 2 daughters.
A dozen. Like they made Disney movies called Cheaper by the Dozen to exaggerate large families.
Yeah.
I mean, this is as Irish Catholic as it gets.
It's very big. I can't even imagine it. Just keeping track of, you know, a couple of people in my life is a struggle. So they all were raised on Hidden Valley Road, thus the name of the book, in the Woodman Valley part of town. 6 of the boys were diagnosed with schizophrenia, beginning with the oldest son, Donald, and I'm just giving like an overview and then we'll just talk psychology. And 3 of the sons were actually already dead by the time Don died in 2003. And one had been diagnosed with schizophrenia, killed his girlfriend and then himself. Kathy's going to talk a little bit about how that's actually quite rare in a schizophrenic diagnosis. Mimi died in 2017, and today Donald lives in a Pueblo nursing home and Matthew lives in a Springs nursing home, as there's no housing for those affected by brain disorders in their area. And then all of the other folks, you know, live other places. But this family has absolutely been stigmatized, and this documentary definitely criminalizes them in many ways, and I'm not sure if that's an entirely accurate representation of what's going on here, but I know we wanted to talk about, in fact Kathy was going to talk a little bit about just schizophrenia in general and sort of the kind of schizophrenia that you're seeing in this series.
Yeah, so schizophrenia is so within our field we have our DSM diagnostic, it's our diagnostic manual. And schizophrenia falls under what we would call psychotic disorders. And it's a really serious mental health condition. It affects how people think. It affects how their perception of things. It affects how they act or organize their thinking. And it's composed usually of a combination of delusions and hallucinations. So hallucinations would involve seeing things or hearing things that aren't there, or even tasting or feel like experiencing something on the skin. That would be like a hallucination. It's a sensory distortion. And then you have delusions, which involve beliefs about things that are not true. And they could be, you know, either rational or irrational. Usually in schizophrenia, it's quite bizarre, the delusions. But the pinpoint or the benchmark really is these are folks who seem to lose touch with reality, and it can make daily living really hard. So these aren't folks that just have unusual thoughts that maybe are, I don't know, a result of a certain culture or a spiritual belief that, we pathologize. It's not that. That would be pathologizing somebody's culture. This literally has to do with a complete break from reality in which it puts their life at risk. And sometimes, which we'll talk about here in a moment, it can also put other folks at risk. In general, and this is something I want to talk about because I thought this was so interesting in this documentary, especially it falling within one family. So there's a lot to unpack here. I used to work with folks found not guilty by reason of insanity, and I worked with folks who were called mentally disordered offenders, and many of them had committed crimes based on a psychotic disorder in which either they weren't taking their medication or they were never diagnosed, and therefore their hallucinations and delusions led them into this, what we call like paranoid ideations or paranoid thinking, which essentially means that they feel that there's a threat to their safety. Okay. Most folks with schizophrenia are actually not dangerous people. And that's something that you don't really take away from this documentary. The documentary actually emphasizes that schizophrenia equates with psychopathic deviance.
Which we've talked a lot about, how that's a cultural bias and misnomer. Because we sensationalize when it turns out to be murder.
Yeah. And sometimes these are how characters are written in horror movies and things like that. So although there can be an overlap of violence with someone who has schizophrenia, it's pretty much only folks who have these, what we call command auditory hallucinations, that tell them that if they don't act on whatever it is the voice is telling them to do, that something harmful either happened to their family or happened to them, right? So they might hear a voice that instructs them that if they don't kill their parents are really the devil. This is like a really oversimplified one, but they can get deeper than that. So to make a long story short, that's a very, very unique. And even in those circumstances, they're not overtly violent all the time. It's usually over a period of time, these hallucinations will become more profound. They'll start to feel scared of what the voices are telling them, but they're not molesting their family members. They're not, being violent and doing all of these other, just like I said before, antisocial behaviors. So I thought this story was really just kind of important to talk about because to me it's an outlier. So I don't know. I just wanted to kind of plant that as we talk about this because my disclaimer was this is actually very atypical.
Yeah, and the family has spoken out about how the Galvin family has spoken out about how they didn't appreciate what ended up happening with the documentary. They went into it, the brothers who actually are diagnosed with schizophrenia were, what I've read in articles is that they were pretty excited to share their story because they thought that maybe it would get the word out about how fucked up our mental health system is and how they didn't get the help that they need, kind of thing. They were wanting to advocate for themselves and their family, and their perspective is that it went the way of that drive to entertain with sensationalism around mental health took hold, and that's where HBO and the creators of this decided to go because
it's more viewers.
Yeah, it's very graphic. It's very sensational. Of course, it's probably why I clicked on it, but I clicked on it because I'm like, schizophrenia, huh?
And how do you get 6 out of the 12?
It's a very compelling title just from a psychological perspective because I'm like 6 schizophrenic siblings. I have to investigate what that is. And so, because that would be incredibly rare. And, the family has talked about how that it feels kind of tragic that they're sensationalizing major mental illness in deference to these violent blockbuster films, which we love, of course, like Joker, Shutter Island, etc. These are movies that we love, but in this situation, this documentary is sensationalizing the violent aspects of that.
Yeah. I just wanted to really quickly insert this while we're on the topic, that there is a there's a huge genetic factor to schizophrenia. So even though 6 sounds kind of crazy, we know that upwards of like almost 80% of the risk of schizophrenia lies in the genes. But what happens to these people in their everyday life sort of determines whether the gene is expressed, which is why you see the nephew at one point.
Yeah.
I felt really bad.
Oh my
for
God.
him.
That was a really interesting part of the story, you guys. They actually, once they tell the bulk of the story in one of the episodes, they kind of flash to now, basically, and these kids that are being raised as, grandkids and nephews and all of that, and how that one kid, his anxiety disorder had him by the balls, basically, around, I'm going to get schizophrenia, and he was so scared.
Yeah, he had seen what his uncles had done, what had happened to them, and he essentially spent the first 18 years of his life. Men are usually diagnosed earlier than women, typically between 18 and 24.
And so he's in that age range.
And he was just waiting to get to that age.
He was just waiting. Can you imagine this poor kid with anxiety, just like internalized anxiety from a young age? Because I imagine, I don't know this person, I imagine for whatever genetic piece there is, and then who he is as a person, and then also hearing all these traumatic stories as a child and having these traumatic things happen in your family, and you not being able to understand them as a kid, has you grow up with this internalized, palpable panic and anxiety. And his was obviously very focused on, I'm going to get schizophrenia.
Yeah.
And he was at that age range during the documentary. And so he talked a lot about it. And that was, you're right, that was a really interesting part. I had forgotten about it. They also make it seem like mental illness and sexual child abuse are cause and effect put together. Now, hey, we talk a lot about a lot of sensational killers on this show. We're not trying to be like morally above it all with this at all.
All of a sudden.
At all. However, I think most of the time when we're in our right minds, we try to say like it's the whole picture. And of course, there are certain things that happen repeatedly. But I thought this was interesting because one of the family members said, there is no correlation between major mental illness and sexual child abuse. And where they're getting that is that the fact that in general, the U.S. population, the statistic they were talking about was that 1 in 4 women and 1 in every 20 men report to have been sexually abused as a child. With that kind of very high incidence of sexual child abuse, there's going to be a ton of crossover with mental illness.
Sure.
It's not that it's cause and effect.
No.
It's that it's just so common.
It's correlated.
It's like how substance use is very much co-occurring with mental illness many times because they're self-medicating with substances and then develop an addiction and or family and or whatever. It's just substance abuse is so common.
Yes.
That it's bound to be there with mental illness sometimes. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I do. And I think also what isn't mentioned in this, because it's not the direction of where this particular documentary was going, is that usually when you see incest in a family, there's an intergenerational trauma that it's quite possible that the person who is committing the incest against their sibling was also molested or their parents were molested. It's intrafamilial. And so that's where this documentary made everything look like it was all linked to the schizophrenia. I want to mention one thing before we move further, which is what Shannon was talking about as far as the environment goes. There was a term also back in the day coined by Frida from Reichman. She coined the term back in 1948, but it was actually used a lot between the 50s and like the early 80s, which is the concept of the schizophrenogenic mother. And it suggests that certain types of mothers may contribute to the development of schizophrenia in their children. And these mothers are characterized as uncaring, highly critical, controlling, and cold. And the theory proposes that the negative and dysfunctional behavior of these mothers can lead to paranoid thoughts, delusions, and ultimately schizophrenia in their offspring. And it goes back to that theory of like the good enough mother. And so this is something that has been debunked. But I think we can talk about environment early on, and I do think that the mother really did enable certain things.
Yeah, so this is an interesting conversation in many ways, right? Because the children in these articles that I've been reading, and I'm not meaning all the children because not all of the children wanted to speak to this, but I think it was one of the daughters that was saying, they really blamed my parents
Yeah.
And her thought was, my parents were the most loving, kind, wonderful people. And that's not my experience of them being vilified as horrible parents. But I think what you're talking about is we can only go by what we're seeing in the documentary. So the family has a point, right? We weren't there. We don't know what they were like. And I would imagine each child in this family, as we know, would have experienced their parents in a different way. And with 12 kids, there's a big age range there of parents and kids and all of that. And often younger kids experience their parents differently than older kids. But this particular person in this family was like, they just don't understand what was going on in her family. But from the documentary, what we observed were several things. And I think that was where you were going.
Well, and this may have been the other sister, because the sister in the documentary, Mary, who was interviewed quite a bit, her experience was different, but she was also the one that was forced to stay with the brothers in the house. The other sister was sent, I think, to their aunt and uncle's house or something. And Mary said...
And grew up, quote unquote, normally.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so Mary said that I was not allowed to get angry. Or that meant I was mentally ill. So when she was being molested by her brother Jim, she had to really, one, her mom didn't want to hear about it. Two, if she showed any emotion or anger, then there was this risk of her also being sent away to a place, because the brothers were allowed to really wreak havoc. The mother thought she knew, Mary says our mother thought she knew best, and keeping them home was better. All the while, they're sitting here doing all these destructive things, and Jim is molesting his own sister.
And I remember Mary talking about how in the family, because of she was, the girls were younger, the one girl was younger, and there were all of these brothers having all of this mental illness. There's a ton of trauma. Your whole family, all of the kids around you, all of your siblings are unpredictable, angry, irritable, not making sense sometimes, having aggression, hurting each other, bullying each other. There was a lot of what could be normative boy behavior and a lot of stuff that was precursor to what ended up happening with several of them along the way. And I remember Mary saying in the documentary that being angry wasn't allowed, because if you were angry, that meant you were going to get diagnosed with schizophrenia.
Right.
Because that's what would happen first, irritability, and they would start beating each other up, and then
displaced anger.
The parents would take them to the doctors, and then they would get diagnosed, and then there was no meds, and then there was meds, and all these different things. And Mary was like, I never said I had any kind of problem, because if I said I was, if Mary was the one that was molested, which I'm sorry if I'm getting the names wrong.
Yeah, Mary was the one molested.
Okay, yeah. So it's like if she were to say anything, or that she was angry about that, or that anything was happening to her, then it wasn't okay. It meant you were sick. It meant you were sick, not that you were a victim.
That's right.
You were sick.
Well, so here's the thing about all that, right? It's because there's this culture around mental illness and the stigma around it in this family. I want to go back a moment, because I forgot about this part, which is relevant to when we were talking about all these other contextual pieces of how, sexual molesting doesn't happen in isolation. Something precedes it. I forgot. Some of you listening are like, she forgot this, so I'm going back. The priest actually would visit mom while dad was away, and he was grooming the family to molest the boys. Mm-hmm. So there it is. That's where that seed was planted. That's not necessarily because the brother had schizophrenia that he molested his sister. He was molested. And I think that's a really important piece to decipher. Otherwise, you look at it and you go, oh, people with schizophrenia are also child molesters.
And they're also saying and you have schizophrenia because you've been molested, like what I was saying before. So there's all of these things that the documentary is carving together for sensationalism.
Right.
Understandably so. As I hope everyone listening to this, because I think we have an extremely intelligent audience, knows that when you watch documentaries, it's crafted. It's edited together. It's not truth, quote unquote. The filmmaker has an agenda. The agenda was to explicate this family story because it is so unique and also horrible. It's also because true crime is very popular and there's a lot of violence and abuse. And then also to then kind of tack on some human stories that you can be very empathetic with. Because there was that sprinkled among it. I had tremendous empathy for everyone, really, in this documentary, including the parents, because I can't even imagine what this would have been like. Like, I can't even imagine. I mean, also, I noticed there were things along the way that they didn't emphasize, understandably so. At one point, Joe had a TBI.
Yes.
And we know that that's a huge issue. All of these things that we're talking about are issues with the brain. And that brings me to one thing I did want to mention.
And Shannon means a traumatic brain injury when she says it.
Yeah,
TBI.
sorry.
Yeah.
Yes, I do. One point, the sister that was talking in this interview discusses how, well, for whatever it's worth, she says, my brothers didn't have schizophrenia. They had something called anosognosia. So I want to speak to that a little bit.
It's funny you say that, because I was going to ask you, do you believe that this was schizophrenia? Because that was going through my head through a lot of this doc, but go ahead.
No, understandably so. And we can't know because each kid had like unique sets of stuff happen to them. Lots of trauma, actual physical injuries. They were hurting each other all the time. Who knows? Like, I don't even know how you keep 12 kids happy and safe. Like, I don't even know how you do that.
Yeah.
But that's just beyond my capacity to understand. I'm sure there are massive families out there that are just fine, but anosognosia. It's a neurological condition in which the patient is unaware of their neurological deficit or psychiatric condition. I don't understand saying they don't have schizophrenia and then saying, no, they had this, because this is just explaining that they didn't know they had schizophrenia.
That's exactly right. They're very different. Anosognosia is just, it's an impairment that we see in people who have certain types of like psychotic disorders or neurological disorders. The nausea just means there's a deficit in this area. So we know that people with speech pathology can have certain diagnoses. It's just sort of further describing.
Because when you watch this documentary, you'll see that a lot of them just literally say, I don't have that, and then display traits.
Yeah, so both can be true.
That's right.
Yeah.
So I didn't understand, okay. You can get this condition from a brain lesion. It is associated with dementia.
Well, here's another thing.
So,
right? That these boys were crying for help.
Yeah.
Throughout their whole life. And mom and dad ignored it and basically told them that they didn't have anything.
Yeah, the denial is massive. Also, like I was saying, this one kid, and I think more of the kids had this because they were so violent with each other, at least from what was described, is that you can get this condition, this sort of like lack of acknowledgement of your mental illness from a traumatic brain injury.
For sure.
It just begs all of the questions. And this is why psychology is so complex and such a creative art in many ways, because each kid would have been different. There's child abuse, there's violence against each other, there's denial of reality, meaning gaslighting in the family. There's all these other things going on. And I just don't know. I mean, yes, of course, in the documentary, many of the people displayed traits right there on camera.
Well, and we know that anosognosia is pretty common in folks who have disorders that are stigmatized by society. Bipolar disorder is oftentimes comorbid with this type of denial, and psychotic disorders. So all of this anosognosia really just also comes from having a lack of ability to internalize something because your psyche cannot accept it because of what it would mean if you had it. Mm-hmm. And another thing I wanted to say too is this was a time, so going back to mom and some of her decisions, as we know that maybe she didn't make the best decisions. However, here's one reason why I believe she did make some of her decisions. This was the 70s? Mm-hmm. They were giving electroshock therapy to children, and they were giving neuroleptics that were the medication and the shock therapy to the brain at this time. And we're like just a good 10 years outside of lobotomies. This was not how we treat schizophrenia now. And I would understand as a parent why that would be really terrifying.
Another thing they probably didn't know or didn't understand, I think, is that a lot of times they were very compliant with their care. And we experience sometimes schizophrenics that are unmedicated or violent people or people who are mentally ill as being non-compliant.
Right.
And I just think it's an interesting distinction because I think you and I have experienced a vast array, a spectrum, a rainbow, if you will, of compliance level. And it doesn't correlate directly with how severe your mental illness is. I've had very severely mentally ill people be completely compliant with medication, with what I was asking them to do, or questions I was asking them to answer, or things I was talking to them about coping with. And then I've had people who were on the spectrum of severe to mild. I've had people that were mildly mentally ill be completely non-compliant with everything I've said, everything their doctors have said, their families want, like everything. And one of the things that it seemed to portray is that people are non-compliant because they don't think anything's wrong with them, right? So with this condition, if they had that they would be completely non-compliant. But really what many of the brothers that were in this documentary wanted to do was say, like, I can't find long-term care where I live. I am compliant. I want it. I want the help. Because I know I'm struggling to function. They might say I'm not schizophrenic and then be talking about biblical delusions, about how
their extremism.
John, Mark, Matthew, and Luke are right over there on the bench with me. They might be doing that and then saying I'm not schizophrenic, but they weren't non-compliant with wanting help. So, right. I don't know.
That's really true. That's really true, which goes to show you the environment someone is in while they're going through this. And when I was working with folks who were going back into the community, one of the biggest parts of the work was working, if the family was part of their life, we'd have to do a lot of psychoeducation and work with the families, as we do in a lot of situations where there's high risk, but specifically with psychotic disorders, because if the family is against recognizing that their family member is ill, we're going to see some recidivism. And some of these folks have killed their parents, killed their siblings, killed a neighbor. It's serious. So if you have a family that isn't supportive or is rejecting the care that's needed, it doesn't necessarily equate with, like what you're saying, with the client themselves and what they know they need to do to be better.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess our biggest thought, it seems, is to once again say there was so much going on in this family that is adjacent to the fact that they had schizophrenic traits. Because at one point they talk about how one of the kids or more than one of the kids witnessed the dad have a stroke. Like, I think he had a stroke right in front of the Peter, one of the kids named Peter. And all the money and all the leadership in the family was gone all of a sudden, because they had a very traditional family, a very heteronormative, traditional family where dad made the money and mom stayed home with all these kids, of course. And so when dad had a stroke, and I don't know, like having a stroke in front of your kids, that's very traumatic for everyone. And then all of the money's gone, and also the leadership of the family is destroyed. So that can happen to any family, but it happened to this family along with all of these issues. So I think our overarching thing is that it's so much more complex than what the documentary would show. But additionally, I would suggest watching the documentary. It's very interesting.
It is.
And if you so choose, like we did, look into what the family thinks about it, look into a little bit more of what was really going on and the culture. It might be an interesting deep dive for you, psychology nerds out there. And we appreciate you listening to our show, and we will catch you next time. This has been an episode of Terror Talk. My name is Shannon.
And I'm Kathy. Sleep safe, everyone.